Welcome to the Creating Belonging podcast. My guest is Al D, CEO and founder of BetterWorks Labs. Let Al introduce himself.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Al D. I'm the founder of BetterWorks Labs. I'm a leadership development consultant, and I work with companies to help smart people become people smart, equipping their managers and leaders with the human skills they need to create great companies that allow their people to thrive.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you on the podcast, Al. Let's go ahead and dive right in. We talked about the focus of this podcast really around the Creating Belonging model. You've explored it a bit. I understand that you've done a bit of research on self-awareness. In the book, we talk about belonging being at the intersection of authenticity and acceptance. Self-awareness is a really big part of authenticity. I'd love to hear from you, just your perspective on self-awareness related to authenticity in the bigger picture of creating belonging.
Some of the research I've done draws from some of the work from Dr. Tasha Eurich, who has written a book about self-awareness and done a ton of research on this topic. Some of her research has proven that, ironically enough, while about 95% of us like to think that we're self-aware, only about 15% of us are actually self-aware. How 80% of people think they're above average drivers, right? That idea where
yes.
We all want to think that we're self-aware and that we know ourselves and that we're very attuned with ourselves, but in reality, less of us actually are. And I think what that ultimately comes down to is that, as you alluded to, some of the research shows that there's essentially two types of self-awareness. The first is this kind of internal self-awareness, right? And I think this really hones in on some of the work that you talk about at that intersection of authenticity and belonging, in the sense of knowing yourself, knowing who you are, your strengths, your aspirations, what you feel you need, anything like that. And that is one part of it. The other component of self-awareness is this idea of external self-awareness, in terms of all of those things, but with how the external world sees us. Right? None of us live in a vacuum. We all exist in a larger, broader system around us. I think where this comes back, ultimately, I think about within the context really of belonging, is this idea that who you are and your own internal self-awareness is really important to be able to do a lot of things that you said, in terms of being able to know who your true self is, being able to understand what it means to show up as authentic in your own skin and feelings, being true to who you are. And in addition to that, all of us exist in a world that is much bigger than just yourself. And so being able to understand how others might see that and perceive that can also be incredibly helpful, I think, for two reasons. One, because it helps you understand how you might be showing up and making sure that you're showing up in the right way. But what I also think, and why it matters, particularly, I do a lot of work with leaders who sometimes will say, well, what does it mean for me to really create a sense of belonging, or to create a culture where people feel like they belong? It is important, where I think it's really on leaders to better understand what actions they might take, or how might they show up, might impact the way that they are able to or not able to create that sense of belonging for their direct reports, or for the larger organization or the broader culture around them. That is where I see the importance of self-awareness really coming into play for all people, but particularly for leaders who have that responsibility of hopefully creating that sense of belonging for others.
Mm-hmm. The two parts of self-awareness being your internal self-awareness and external self-awareness. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on how that relates to the creating belonging model of, that the concept of acceptance. We start with authenticity, then move into acceptance of others. It sounds like there could be some overlap there in external self-awareness and acceptance. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I think one of the things I think about is that it is easier for people to show up externally when they're able to do the work internally on themselves first, right? You can always put on a facade, or you pretend to be someone that you're not. Maybe sometimes you feel like you do have to do that because of the realities of your workplace, or just not being in a great culture, or feeling othered. But I do think that when you can come to a greater kind of self-awareness, and perhaps even acceptance of yourself and who you are, mm-hmm. all the things about you that make you who you are, for better or for worse, I do think it does help you understand how you can then show up externally and how others may perceive you. And on the other side of that, A lot of the work I do around self-awareness really is around leaders and helping them make sure that they're aware of their biases or things that they may not be able to see as clearly. They are not paying attention to it. Sometimes we just can't see the way that others perceive us because that's just the lack of our perspective. And so a lot of times I think that external self-awareness can be helpful to us internally to help us see things that we may not be able to see ourselves, or to see things within us that others see clearly that may be hard for us to see on our own. I think that's how I see it coming in, but I'd be curious to know what you think, or what got you curious about it, or where you see some of the intersection points.
What really resonated with me in what you said there was as a part of the work that you do with leaders in their self-awareness is working on understanding their own biases and kind of how they're seeing others. And I think that's a big part of it, because when I talk about authenticity, it's not just I'm me, deal with it. It is understanding myself and the way that I view the world, and that there's other ways of viewing the world, but understanding kind of how my perception contrasts with others allows us to move into the radical acceptance of others that I talk about, understanding that there are more identities, more values, more perspectives in the world than my own. And I think we have to start with self-awareness to be able to do that. I think that's sometimes where a lot of work that happens with diversity training, bias training, whatever that is missing that self-awareness piece, doing the digging for yourself and understanding not just my own identities and I am who I am, but really understanding more about how my values contrast with those around me.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a scenario. We were working with a leader recently, and they had just gone through a 360-degree assessment where they got qualitative feedback for the first time from various stakeholders within their organization. Some of it was stuff they knew and were not surprised by, and a whole slew of it was stuff that really caught them off guard. When we were debriefing and reflecting on it, one of the things that they said to me was, as they really internalized some of the feedback, they could trace some of those elements back to how they were raised as a child, which is not uncommon if you do this work, right? Your environment often shapes who you are. But the thing that they said to me that I thought was so important was their reflection upon that experience. The way that I see the world, the way that I lead is very much shaped by a set of experiences that happened so long ago. It wasn't until seeing the impact of what those experiences were through this feedback, because of other people who had been on the receiving end of the way they communicated, the way they engaged, where they realized, wow, there are things in my life that have impacted me in such a way, and they are directly related to how I lead. And if I'm not careful and understanding of that, I'm not going to be able to be the leader that I want to be. One of the things I remember after the conversation was this general idea: if we're stepping into a leadership role, we need to better understand that, to get attuned with some of those drivers of how we see the world, how we interact, how we engage, how we foster a sense of belonging. If we don't understand the drivers behind what's fueling that, we may not understand the implications of how we're showing up, particularly if it's being negatively perceived by others.
I love those 360 experiences. I recall several years ago a 360 experience where a leader had such a negative reaction to his feedback that he thought he knew who was giving some of the negative feedback, and he went into the hallway and called them and tried to fire them on the spot. That was pretty wild. If you're going through a 360, don't assume who's giving you the feedback, and don't try to fire someone from it.
Right.
I'd love to hear kind of, moving into your experiences in relation to the various parts of the creating belonging model. I'm curious if you can think back to your professional experiences and any that pop out or resonate for you.
Yeah. For those who don't know me, I am Asian American. I grew up in the United States. My mom grew up in Hong Kong, and my father grew up in the United States. But I have always been, growing up at least, I'd always been in pretty diverse environments, or what I thought to be as diverse environments. And also looking back, I never really felt that I looked or was different than other people. even though I did look different than a lot of other people, particularly in the environments that I was in. I remember getting into the workforce and working in management consulting and looking up to the ranks of the leaders and people in those positions, realizing that there were not a lot of people that looked like me who were Asian or Asian American. And even in the cases where there were Asian leaders, they definitely were not vocal. There's a lot of research and studies about Asian culture and what that is. It was really hard for me because at that point in time, I definitely had aspirations of wanting to really rise up through the organization. And I've always just been someone who's been incredibly vocal. And so it did make me wonder, as I'm sure it might make other people wonder who do feel like they might be in a minority group within an organization of, do I have a place here? And do I have a voice here? Am I going to be someone that is going to be accepted? Am I going to be someone who, because this saying goes, if you can't be what you can't see, sometimes it can feel like an uphill battle to really feel like you belong and that you can be successful. And so I think what it made me do at that point, I was probably in the minimizing category, camp, if you will. They're trying to downplay certain aspects of myself so that I didn't stand out like a sore thumb, or trying to pull back in certain ways because I wasn't sure if that was going to be accepted or enable me to be successful. And so the easiest thing to do was to just kind of minimize it. Like I kind of knew who I was, but like it was hard for me to want to fully lead into that. And so that was definitely a place where I maybe didn't necessarily feel like that stronger sense of belonging. But what I would say is that on the flip side of that, I remember working on a project. I started working with a team in particular. I remember working on a project and getting a performance review after the project where my manager at the time went through the performance review with me and everything was going well. And one of the things she said to me in an offhanded way was just, whatever you're doing, just keep being you. Just keep being you. What you bring to this team, we need more of that. So just keep doing it. It was one of those moments where I honestly felt seen in all of the right ways, where I felt like who I was, my ethos, the way that I engaged, the way that I worked, the way that I saw the world was accepted. And I really started to feel that sense of acceptance, that it was really who I was. And by her just kind of saying this simple phrase of just keep being you, it almost like was this unconscious trigger of like, okay, you're safe here. You can fully be who you are. And so those are just two stories that come to mind in terms of, particularly in my earlier days of my career, of just working through the journey of belonging.
So I love that you had this manager who said, just keep being you. I want to loop back around it. I want to go back to that external self-awareness. How did that kind of validation of keep being you, reinforce or influence your external self-awareness?
Was that it made me realize that the way in which I was working on the team, the way in which I was engaging, the work I was doing was making an impact, and that other people appreciated it. And looking back and knowing what I know now of this particular leader, because we've gotten to be fairly close, what she really appreciated about what I brought to the team was that I was someone who was inviting, who was welcoming. I was someone who was constantly engaging others, asking for their ideas and for their feedback. I was someone who was making time to get to know people, to build a sense of trust with others, both on the team as well with the client. And I did those things because that's who I was. Going back to the external self-awareness thing, what it made me realize in that moment with that piece of feedback was that she was telling me that, yeah, like keep doing that. Like, yeah, like keep leaning into that. That stuff matters. In the world of professional services, a lot of the things I just mentioned, professional services is a human to human business. If you can do some of those things, you can have a pretty good career in that field. And so I think I definitely had some of my own kind of limiting beliefs in play initially of, are these things going to be accepted? But with her giving me that encouragement, it was almost like a tripwire for me in a positive way of, oh, this is someone telling you that the things you think about yourself, which you are manifesting into behaviors, are actually a good thing. And this is something where you can safely lean into it because someone has created that space and given you that encouragement to keep doing it. And it certainly helped that if it was another teammate, at my level, that certainly would have been nice and helpful and probably would have helped my external self-awareness. Like, oh, my teammates think I'm great. But it was an added bonus that this was a leader in this case who had some level of resource, of privilege, of whatnot. And so it definitely became a pretty powerful evidence piece, particularly on the external self-awareness side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you've got someone in that position of power validating and saying, please bring more of what you're bringing, I think that's great. So back to, I wanted to talk about, you had mentioned, earlier when you were in a place of, felt like you were probably in a place of minimizing and you were in an organization where there wasn't a lot of representation. I recall you telling me a story about an interaction with a leader relative to representation. Would you mind sharing that?
So as I mentioned, I quickly learned that there were not a lot of people that looked like me. One of my self-reflections from that experience was I felt like I needed to do a bit of work in terms of figuring out if I did want to stay at the company, what that journey would look like and what I could do to be successful. One of the things I did was attend the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit internally. You had to apply to it. And so I applied and said, this could be a good chance to meet other people, hopefully meet some other either some other allies or some people who look like me, who are in positions of power, etc. So I went, and I remember going to the event, and they really did pull out all the stops. They had a lot of senior leaders at the firm, both folks who were allies to DEI, as well as individuals who did come from groups that were traditionally underrepresented. I was maybe 24, 25. So I was still pretty young and junior. And while normally I'm pretty good in social settings, it definitely was a little bit overwhelming. And I remember at one point, a older gentleman came up to me. He introduced himself. He was external of the company, but he was an invited guest. We just started talking. He also was Asian American. He had been a longtime executive and now worked with a different diversity nonprofits, has been an advisor. And every now and then someone would come by and he would say, oh, do you know him, or do you know her, or do you know them? All these people were the ones signing. Well, some of them literally was, I think, the name of the guy who signed on my paycheck, or the one that I got like every 2 weeks. So like pretty like big name figures. And he's introducing me to all these people. He's inviting me into conversations, and he's really going out of his way to lend me a little bit of social capital so that I could feel welcomed and accepted. It was a huge help in the moment because it was a little bit overwhelming, particularly of how more junior I was. And so the event was maybe 2 days. And at the end, I found him and just went up to him and said, hey, I just want to thank you. It was great to meet you, but I really appreciate how you went out of your way to make me feel included and invite me into the conversation. And he said, happy to do that. It's why we come to these things. At the end, he said, hey, if I can ask you a favor. And I said, sure. And he said, next time you're in an event like this, and you come across someone who looked like you when you first came to this event, please do what you can to make them feel like they belong. And it was a humbling and powerful moment for me because I assumed that he was just trying to help me out. I was definitely one of the youngest people there, but it showed me that he was aware of what was going on in my head, even if I wasn't fully aware of it. In that moment, he did what he could to help out someone else, to make sure they felt included and they felt like they belonged. And what I think it showed me, though, is that, and what I would then learn from here on out, is that I still haven't been someone like him. I'm not a retired C-suite executive, like that kind of social capital or credibility per se. But in any given room, belonging can be relative, or feeling included can be relative. There might be something I can do in those rooms. It may not be what he could have done, but there can be something I could do. I have tried to be mindful of that. When I am in positions where I can do something, I really try to do it, no matter how small or large it is, because that experience taught me that I do have the capacity to do that. I've really tried to do that ever since.
Yeah, I love that kind of ask that he had of you to pay it forward for future folks, to make sure they feel included and belong. I mentioned in my opening episode that there's the story I tell about when I had my boss who was like, hey, don't be so gay. I went in the closet for a bit. And now I really work to be out. It's not just for my own authenticity. It is for others. So they have that, that role model, that someone that is visible, that can help them understand that they too can be out. And that's one big piece of it, is leaning into that authenticity for others to
Sure.
be out
Yeah.
with, whatever it is, with your identity, be it visible or not visible, so that we can pay it forward for others. I love that.
Yeah. It's such a powerful mental model and thought process. And I mean, I think I said this briefly in the beginning, but we all live and work in an organizational system that is much larger and bigger than ourselves. That doesn't mean we need to be martyrs, but we do have a little bit of choice and agency for how we choose to show up in any given moment. And when I think of belonging and anything related to the DE&I movement, I often like to think about this idea of lightning bolts or drum beats, right? The lightning bolts are the big ahas and the big moments. Those are good and important, but it's the drum beats, those many things that we choose to do each and every day. There's many habits and practices that ultimately, if practiced over time, can make a small dent in what we as individuals can do. How you choose to show up, how you choose in any given moment can do one little thing like that guy did for me to help someone else belong. That's what matters. We may not all have the luxury to make a lightning bolt happen, but we all have the ability to make those drum beats happen.
I'm going to extend out your metaphor a bit. I think sometimes what may feel like a drum beat for us
is
one tap of the drum for us, that could be someone else's lightning bolt, right?
Oh, that's such a great point.
It seems small to us, but for someone else, it's a really big gesture and a big deal. I love that. Well, thank you for that, Al. I think that's a really great point to kind of close out, is thinking about how we can beat the drum on a daily basis so that we're continuing to move things forward. I want to thank you so much for being a guest on my Creating Belonging podcast. As we close out, I just want to make sure that people can find you and connect with you. So what are some good ways for folks to find you?
Thank you so much, Justin. Folks can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Al D. Feel free to connect with me and tell me that Justin sent you my way. You can check out my website, Better Work Labs. If you're looking to help your people become people smart, get in contact with me by checking out my website. Thank you, Justin. It's been great chatting with you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode in the next 2 weeks.